Being a new dad means you get a lot less time to do this. Between the Series X and the PS5, if you could only pick one of them, which one should you spend your time and effort going after? Better stay tuned to find out. Hey, I'm Sam with Sisters of Impact. I help new dads who now have a lot less time to enjoy tech and gaming know what to spend their time and money on so they don't experience buyer's remorse. This is gonna be a rock'em sock'em robot moment to find out which one of the PS5 or the Series X comes out on top. So let's dive right into it. The first thing we're gonna look at is the consoles themselves. Now, from an aesthetics perspective, me personally, this is totally subjective, the PS5, I just don't like the look of it. To me, the thing is hideous. It looks like an eyesore. So for me, I end up having it outside in the, not necessarily outside of the house, but behind other things where it's just out of sight, out of mind. As long as it has plenty of ventilation, I don't really care. Whereas the Series X, I have it just right on the entertainment center. It fits in with the other things that I have on my entertainment center, and it just looks better for me personally. The next thing to really look at from these consoles is just the overall horsepower that they have. Now, the Series X technically is more powerful. It is running off of RDNA 2 architecture, whereas the PS5 is technically a hybrid between RDNA 1 and 2. So it's not, from a throughput perspective, the Series X does have more horsepower, but the key here is how easy is it for the developers to tap into that horsepower? Right now you're looking at the PS5, their development kits were relatively unchanged going from the PS4 to the PS5, whereas the Series X was drastically different between the Series X and the Xbox One era. So developers are having to essentially relearn how to implement things on the Series X side. However, once they start to get to that point, there are certain things that make it much easier down the long run, but for developers to implement and to be able to take advantage of a lot of that horsepower, they're gonna have to get used to the platform. As of this video with the PS5, you are seeing more performance gains in third-party titles in relative to the Series X. So that's just something to keep in mind. That's probably not something that's going to go from the long term, but it is something in the near term that you're going to need to take into account. Now, one thing that just irritates the hell out of me when it comes to the PlayStation 5 is storage. Not only do you have a smaller SSD in the PS5, but you also get less access to that storage. And so you're only looking at about 680 gigs when things are all said and done. Now, depending on what kind of games you play on your PS5, that's really going to depend on how many games you can store on it. You can use a USB storage device to go ahead and store games on. You're just not able to play them off of it. Whereas the Series X, you get more storage on the hard drive. You're getting like 800 and some odd gigs. You also have expandable storage that, although it is relatively pricey at this particular point, you're thinking over $200, you're getting an extra 1 terabyte of disk space that is as fast as the internal storage. It gives you the option to expand that storage, whereas the PS5, especially if you have the digital version, you're kind of hosed. Another thing when it comes to these consoles is the Series X has smart delivery. So if you have a Series X, you're going to download the Series X version of that game. If you download if you have a 1S or a 1X, then you're going to download those respective versions. The PS5, they did come out with an update to where if you have a PS5, it'll go ahead and download the PS5 version, but it still gives you the option to download the PS4 version for some odd reason, like you would ever want to do that. But it does give you that option. So one, it just automates. The other one gives you a choice. Me personally, just automate it for me. I don't want to have to think about it. And this also and this is just from an infrastructure standpoint, where you also have cross saves. And I mentioned this both in the Series X and the PS5 reviews, but infrastructure wise, Microsoft is just way ahead of PlayStation and Sony in general at this point. And that also comes down to cross saves. Now, if I were to play Hitman 3 on my Xbox One X, I go ahead and boot up the Series X. My save is right there. I just play on. From the PS5 version, that may or may not actually work because the infrastructure on each side very different. And as a result, Microsoft's infrastructure has made it easy to go ahead and transfer between generations. PlayStation isn't necessarily at a point to where it's gotten to that ease of use. And so you're having to do workarounds, and Marvel's Avengers is a prime example of this, where if you had your PS4 version and you had your PS5 version, there were quite a few workarounds to potentially get that save file over to the new console. The next piece I want to talk about is the Series X also supports more 120 hertz games at this particular point in time than Sony does and the PlayStation 5. Again, it's just easier to implement. Where on the Series X, it's just a patch the developer can go ahead and just implement, put on the Xbox Store, you're good to go. PlayStation actually requires you to essentially recompile the entire thing and then upload a new version of that game. It's just more cumbersome on the PlayStation side to implement 120 Hertz, and it's up to the developer to actually implement that. And this also kind of ties into just infrastructure again in general. The Microsoft infrastructure is just light years ahead of Sony at this particular point for their console. And most recently, you saw a lot of frame rate improvements to old games from Microsoft, and that's just using a lot of the implementations that they're doing. Without the developer having to do anything, they're increasing a lot of frame rates on a lot of these games. So some of them are coming up to 4K 60. PS5, however, is also doing the same, but mostly on their first-party titles. So like God of War, Ghost of Tsushima, so on and so forth, they're doing 4K 60 on those. But depending on the game, I would suggest you go ahead and look it up. Each site is, touting this quite a bit, but just make sure to go and look up the games that you actually want to play and whether they are getting those performance enhancements. Now, this is kind of a strike against Sony because I just read this over the last couple days and it was coming up in some court documents. I'm not sure exactly the details of it. But the primary thing that has come to light is that Sony is charging its developers to implement crossplay. I mean, seriously, what the hell? So from a console perspective, you're looking at the PlayStation 5 and the Series X, both great consoles, both have their pros and their cons. I personally feel that one looks better than the other. But if I were to choose just based upon the consoles themselves and the infrastructure that each one is using, I would personally go with the Series X on this one. Next up are the controllers. Now, the Series X controller is more of the same, really. It's just kind of like a refinement. You're looking at very little has actually changed. It has a share button now. You're looking at some textured grips. The paddles are a little bit different. Triggers are more refined. You're just getting more of the same. For me personally, ergonomically, this one is still my absolute favorite. I love how it sits. I love how the thumbs are offset. It just, for me personally, my hands can do this particular controller just much longer than the PS5's. The PS5 controller, however, even though it's a little beefier, it doesn't fit my hands very well. It's more of a stretch for me personally. You're also looking at it has advanced haptics. So you're not just seeing just one particular rumble motor, there's multiples and it can be differentiated between those motors. And you're also looking at the adaptive triggers, which based upon the game can define what action's actually taking place. So for Returnal, you can go ahead and just slightly, and that'll go ahead and aim down sight. And then if you go all the way down, it'll enable your secondary fire. A lot of games don't actually take advantage of this. So if it's outside of a Sony first party game, probably not going to get a ton out of it. However, if you're using something like Cold War, now you're going to start to feel just the fire rate. Sometimes it can get super annoying if you're just wanting to chill. If you're just wanting to have a sweaty game, that can be kind of useful, I suppose. But for me personally, the controller, I'm just not the biggest fan of it. And the sheer fact that you're already getting stick drift with this thing after 5 months, and it's the same company that ended up doing the Nintendo Switch analog controllers. So a lot of issues with stick drift, but for me personally, I haven't had a lot of it, but it is definitely irritating. Again, this is a totally subjective opinion here, but for me, the Series X controller is just a refinement. I love that controller. And if it were to have the adaptive triggers and the dynamic haptic feedback, then it would probably be like the absolute perfect controller. But for me personally, the Series X controller is my favorite out of between the PS5 and the Series X. If you're finding value in today's video, make sure to hit that like button. And if you know of somebody that could benefit from this video, make sure to share it with them to help them make the decision of which console to go with. And that brings us to games. The Series X and the PS5 up to this point have taken very different measures when it comes to games. Sony has taken first-party titles to, like, the bar is set so ridiculously high right now. You're looking from God of War, Ghost of Tsushima, even Returnal, although it has had its performance issues, the first-party titles from Sony have been just amazing. Whereas the Series X and Microsoft as a whole, their first-party titles they've been iffy, especially the last few years. If you are not a Halo fan or a Gears fan or even a Forza fan, you haven't had a whole lot to look forward to. Now, both Sony and Microsoft have been going after development studios, especially Microsoft going over 30 plus at this particular point. But right now you're looking at what games are actually on the horizon that you want to play. So for me personally, on the Series X side of things, you're looking at Halo Infinite, definitely stoked for that. You have Avowed, Bright Memory, Hellblade 2, Stalker 2. You have a lot of cool games that are coming up for that particular platform. PlayStation 5 also has a good set of games coming up, and the one that I'm most looking forward to here currently, besides Returnal that just came out, is God of War Ragnarok. I am stoked for that particular game. And the PS5 has already had a couple great exclusive games come out for the PS5. You're already looking at Demon's Souls, Miles Morales, although you can technically play that on the PS4, and then like I mentioned, Returnal. Ratchet & Clank is also going to be really cool to see how that one ends up playing out. Definitely looking forward to that one as well. But really, when it comes down to the exclusive games, it really comes down to which game are you actually looking forward to, and that is actually going to be something that you want to play. Now, the real differentiator between these two when it comes to games is Game Pass. Game Pass is ridiculously good value for the consumer. You're looking at, especially if you have the Ultimate, where you get not only the Xbox games, but you also get PC games on top of that. And you're looking at getting day one first-party studio games from Microsoft on that platform. So from just a value perspective, Game Pass is easily the differentiator when it comes to the difference between PlayStation and Xbox. Another really big differentiator between the two platforms is also backwards compatibility. PlayStation does have backwards compatibility, especially on the PS4 range. As it says, I think it was 99% of the PS4 games are backwards compatible on the PS5. But once you start going beyond that, then you're starting to look at having to use PS Now. So you're essentially having to stream backwards compatibility in that particular case, and it's not the best experience. I'm not personally a fan of it. I just want to be able to use my old games, put it in my new system, and be able to play those games just as if I was playing it on the console themselves. This really is, again, this whole thing is actually subjective, but when you're really looking at the games, what really depends is what specific games are you looking forward to? What games do you currently have, and are you able to play those games? And what is going to be the best investment based upon the ecosystems you have? It really comes down to what games do you want to play and what ecosystem are they in. This is totally subjective, but if you are a fan of Sony's first-party titles, then the PS5 is going to make the most sense from a games perspective. If you are a fan of Microsoft's first-party offerings or backwards compatibility, you just want access to the most games humanly possible with Game Pass, then Microsoft is going to make the most sense here. It really depends on what the games are and where they're actually able to be played. And that brings me to the value that these two systems are bringing. You're looking at the PS5 and the Series X are both $500. So from a price perspective, it's a complete wash. I'm not going to include the digital version because I wouldn't recommend that to anyone for any reason, because you're locking yourself into an ecosystem that you have no way to expand the storage on. So from a price point perspective, that's a wash. I'm not going to suggest that until they potentially give you the option to expand that storage. So until then, not going to recommend that. So from a perspective of value, that really does bring me to which console should you actually go with? And in this particular situation, it really depends. For me personally, I like to have the most powerful hardware that I can get, and I want to be able to play the games that I want to play at the best fidelity that I can play them at. In this particular case, that means the Series X is the clear winner for me. That means I'm going to get the most powerful console, and as developers are able to take advantage of those new development kits and they're able to squeeze a lot of that power out of it, third-party games are going to look the best on the Series X over time. From a games perspective, the Series X just has a ton of games in the pipeline, that a lot of which we don't even have any idea what they are. But a lot of the ones that we do, I'm very excited for. Now, if you have a lot of games from the Sony side of the house that are from their first party offerings, and those are the ones that you're the most excited about, then PS5 is going to make the most sense for you, because obviously you can't get those on the Series X. Ultimately, you're looking at, for you really have to look at what time do I have, and then what am I going to get the most enjoyment out of? If that means playing PlayStation 5 games that are exclusive to that console, or that's the only thing that you're really wanting to get, awesome, go get the PS5. If you want to play games that are on the Series X that are exclusive to that console, or that you're looking at just from a third-party perspective, again, go get the Series X. But again, For me personally, the Series X is the hands down winner just because of Game Pass. Game Pass really is a differentiator, and the overall infrastructure that Microsoft has built over the last few years that really is such a consumer-friendly approach that I can't really say that PlayStation is pro-consumer at this particular point in time. When you look at some of their decision-making processes over the last year or two, it doesn't scream pro-consumer to me. Whereas Microsoft, they're doing a lot of the things that are enabling their consumers to do more with their overall ecosystem. So for me personally, I'm going to suggest the Series X on this one. If you really don't have the price point, then I would say the Series S, because that's a good middle term. But looking at the differentiation, I would go and watch my Series X review to find out which would make the most sense in those areas. And now I want to hear from you. If you could only have one console, the PS5 or the Series X, what would you choose? Leave it in the comments below. If you're still on the fence of what system to go with, make sure to go and watch my review on the PS5 and the Series X to get a little more in depth on each system to see which would make the most sense for you. And if you do have any questions, leave those in the comments below. And happy gaming, I'm out.